Our Western music notation and note naming systems are based on the 7-note diatonic scale. The lines and spaces of our notation system represent the notes of what's often referred to as the C major scale, even though it's probably more accurate to refer to them as the notes in the major mode of the diatonic scale on C. And those notes are given 7 letter names, A through G. Using sharps and flats, those notes can be modified to reach any note that exists in Western music. As I discussed in a previous video titled, "Why Do Different Notes Share the Same Letter Names?", the sharp and flat can be formally defined as the interval between the two notes that replace each other when changing modes of the diatonic scale over a static tonic note, which replaces notes on one end of a chain of fifths with notes from the other end. Put another way, the sharp and flat represent the intervals between a major and minor version of a generic interval class. I also briefly mentioned that such a system can be generalized to any moment of symmetry scale. All MOS scales can be derived from a continuous chain of a single generating interval, and they have exactly 2 sizes for each generic interval class. Those step sizes are swapped out for one another when changing modes of that MOS scale. While the example at the end of that video used a novel microtonal scale structure to show how our Western note naming system could be generalized to another MOS scale, we could also reframe our view of Western music from the perspective of one of the other MOS scales generated by the circle of fifths. Let's try this with the pentatonic scale. To start, we could define the lines and spaces of our notation system to represent the pentatonic scale, and name those notes A through E. Though, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to continue to use our diatonic note naming system and notation alongside the pentatonic one. To define our pentatonic sharp and flat, we can check which notes replace each other when changing modes of the pentatonic scale over a static tonic note. And this is where things get a little weird. It turns out that the pentatonic sharp or flat is the minor second from our diatonic system. This means that any intervals that differ by a minor second in our diatonic system will actually belong to the same generic pentatonic interval class. That is to say, the same way that from C to E and C to E flat are both a kind of third from a diatonic perspective, from C to D and C to E flat are both a type of second from a pentatonic perspective. And of course, with the pentatonic note naming system and notation system, the D and E flat have the same letter name and the same staff location. This lines up with an updated interval naming system based on the steps of the pentatonic scale. What we used to think of as major seconds and minor thirds are now our minor and major seconds. Then, similarly, what we used to think of as major thirds and perfect fourths are now our minor and major thirds, respectively, and so on. Some of the most popular alternatives to the diatonic scale can be described as modified versions of the diatonic scale. For instance, the most common mode of the harmonic scale, which is often referred to as the harmonic minor scale, can be thought of as the minor mode of the diatonic scale with a sharped 7th scale degree. And the minor mode of the melodic scale can be thought of as the major mode of the diatonic scale with a flatted third. If we approached modifying the pentatonic scale from a diatonic perspective, we may be inclined to, say, alter the second note in the scale using a diatonic sharp or flat, giving us something like C, D sharp, E, G, A, C. But a pentatonic alteration of the scale would instead replace the D with an E flat. Not only does this give us a new way to think about pentatonic scales and how alterations thereof might function, it also results in an audible, practical difference for tunings where the sharps and flats are not enharmonically equivalent. That is to say, in tunings where D sharp and E flat are not the same pitch. For example, here's an unmodified pentatonic scale in 19 equal divisions of the octave. Here is our modified version of the scale with an E flat in 19 Edo. And here's the modified version with the D sharp in 19 Edo. We can do the same thing in 17 Edo, where the sharps are higher than the flats instead of lower. Here's the unmodified pentatonic scale. Here's the modified version with the E flat. And here's the modified version with the D sharp instead. A point I made in my previous video about our note naming system was that replacing notes by their sharp or flat versions seems to lead to a higher degree of regularity in the resulting scale structures than you get when replacing them with closely pitched alternatives. The same seems to be true when modifying the pentatonic scale. An unmodified pentatonic scale has two sizes for each pentatonic interval class: seconds, which are inverted pentatonic fifths, and thirds, which are inverted pentatonic fourths. The version of the pentatonic scale modified by the pentatonic sharp, spelled in our diatonic note naming system as C, E flat, E, G, A, C, has three types of pentatonic seconds and three types of pentatonic thirds. The pentatonic scale modified by the diatonic sharp, on the other hand, spelled in our diatonic note naming system as C, D sharp, E, G, A, C, has four types of seconds and four types of thirds. Admittedly, I haven't tested every single possible modification of the pentatonic scale to see if this pattern holds for all cases, so please feel free to point out any counterexamples. And of course, this doesn't mean that the version of the pentatonic scale modified by the diatonic sharp is in any way objectively worse than the version modified by the pentatonic sharp. It does suggest, however, that it might be worth trying if we want to take advantage of that regularity. Here's a short composition in 19 Ito that I wrote around the pentatonic scale and modifications of the pentatonic scale using the pentatonic sharp and flat. I would love to have notated it in the pentatonic notation as well, but doing that by hand without a dedicated program would have been extremely time-consuming. Maybe someday we'll have notation software that lets us choose from arbitrary scale structures, and will let us re-notate pieces in more or less chromatic MOS scales from the same generating interval. Until then, here's the piece notated in diatonic notation. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, please feel free to hit the like button, subscribe and hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any of my future videos, and if you'd like to support this channel, then please consider pledging $1 per video on my Patreon page. Every dollar pledged there gets me closer to being able to work on videos like this one full-time. Thanks again.